And as Bobby welcomed you a moment ago, this is our first meeting of the 22-23 year. I think this is something like our 66th or 67th Marketplace Midland, which is hard to believe, but we're finishing up year 8, and amazingly we'll start year 9 in January. We're very fortunate to have Dr. C Meyer as our speaker, and really appreciate everybody coming out to hear his message. Dr. Meyer he's in Seattle, Washington. He's the director of the Discovery Institute's Center for, let me get this right, Science and Culture. Kind of more relevant to a lot of you is he started his career as a geophysicist with ARCO in Dallas from 1981 to 1985. Shortly after that, he left ARCO and began studying in Cambridge University, where he earned a degree, earned a doctorate in history and the philosophy of science in 1991. His interest in the study of origins led him to complete his doctoral thesis of clues and causes, a methodological interpretation of the origin of life research, a light subject like that. He has gone on to author 3 books that have reshaped the entire theistic-atheistic debate. These 3 are The Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, and most recently, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Dr. Meyer has appeared on NBC and CBS Nightly News, the ABC Sunday Morning, Nightline, Fox News Live, CNN, Good Morning America, and PBS. In addition to being published in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and many other national publications. So why is the study and understanding of origins even important? Why is it relevant? Aren't we a modern society that can explain the universe in a materialistic and random natural selection process? Why should Christians even care? And isn't the debate on origins settled science and over? Well, I think we're finding out today that if there's no creator, then we have some other issues. If we weren't made in the image of God, then there's no difference between a man and a centipede. If God didn't give us the command to be fruitful and multiply, to subdue the earth and have dominion over it, then we have no right to clear a field, plant a garden, or drill a well. And furthermore, if we weren't made in the image of God, and if He didn't make us male and female, then there's really no difference between the institution of marriage. We can choose our own genders, and we're seeing that unfold in our own society right now in front of our eyes and in front of the whole world. So we're finding out that this really is a very, very important subject. And so we're very fortunate to have Dr. Meyer with us to explain his studies and talk about some of the books he's written. And so Dr. Meyer, if you'll come, we look forward to hearing from you.
It's wonderful to be here today, and I'm really blown away by the turnout, and so many people have come. Thank you for your time. We will have a Q&A afterwards, and I wanted to start with just a little story about that. I did have a bit of a culture shock when I went from Dallas working in the oil industry to England, to Cambridge, and in one of my first graduate study seminars, there was a very distinguished visiting professor from Germany lecturing, and he was talking about the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And I'd actually had one course in college philosophy about Kant, but he was talking about some things I had never heard of. And so I raised my hand and asked this visiting professor, that's so interesting, but I've never read any of that in my study of Kant. Could you give me a reference where I could learn more about that? There was this kind of uncomfortable shuffling of feet, and he gave me an answer, and then my supervisor later took me aside, and he said, Mayor, he said, I know in the States you've learned that the only stupid question is the one you didn't ask. It's different here. And then he took me, he said, in future, if you have a question that reveals ignorance, come ask me privately. So I just wanted you to know that for the Q&A after, it will be American rules. No questions are off limits. I want to begin on a bit more sober note, because I think a lot of us have a sense that we're at a kind of a tipping point, or maybe even a crisis point in our country. And I've been thinking about an address that Alexander Solzhenitsyn gave now almost 40 years ago. It's widely known as his "Men Have Forgotten God" address. And in this speech, Solzhenitsyn told the story of his childhood and how soon after the Bolsheviks had taken over in Russia, many old people who were lamenting, as they put it, the disasters that have befallen Russia, would tell him, these things are happening because men have forgotten God. And I've been thinking about some of the disasters that have befallen America in recent years. We have an epidemic of teen suicide, anxiety among the young. We've had these mass shootings that are so troubling. The usual stuff we've been lamenting for 30 years, family breakdown, out-of-wed births. We have this new thing with the medical mutilation of children who think that they were born into the wrong kind of body. We've got the abortion is still with us, crime waves, and now the fentanyl deaths. And this speech of Solzhenitsyn just keeps coming back to me in my mind, and I've been wondering, are these things happening, these disasters befalling America, a consequence of us having forgotten God? There's a new Gallup poll out that shows that belief in God has dipped to an all-time low. It's still 81%, but it's dropped 10% in a decade and 7% in the last 5 years. So there's something going on, and as the pollsters probe more deeply, they find that this accelerating loss of belief is mostly being generated by young people, or among young people in the 18 to 30 age range. The pollsters have a term they use to describe this secularization that's going on in the culture. They call it the rise of the nuns, not little ladies in habits, but the religiously unaffiliated, especially young agnostics and atheists. And so we've been very curious about that too, and so we've done some polling at Discovery Institute, or national survey, and we found as to the reasons that people cite for their rejection of belief. And of course the 81% includes a lot of people who are very nominal, who aren't thinking very much, who have actually forgotten God practically in their lifestyle. But in this polling data, we found that a very surprising answer, and that is that 65% of self-described atheists and over 40% of agnostics say that the findings of science render belief in God less probable, a contributing factor. Now, to us, this isn't terribly surprising because we've been in a spirited scientific and philosophical contest of ideas with people who in the media are known as the new atheists, the scientific atheists, the celebrity spokesman for atheism who are also prominent scientists. And there's a number of these people, you'll be probably familiar with them. Richard Dawkins of Oxford University, who wrote the book, The God Delusion. God is a delusion because science has shown us that there's no need to believe in God. Lawrence Krauss, his title was The Universe from Nothing. And of course, Stephen Hawking got into the act late in his career, writing books like this. He wrote a book called The Grand Design, the point of which was there is no design. And Bill Nye, the science guy who's not actually a scientist but plays one on TV, wrote a book of this kind. And then by contrast, the great Steven Weinberg from the University of Texas, and a Nobel laureate, the great cosmologist, he wrote a book, The First 3 Minutes, but he was very famous for his scientific atheism. He's known to have said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, and he meant to our science, the more it seems pointless, reflecting his atheistic worldview. So it's not surprising that especially young people who are encountering these people as professors are beginning to lose their belief in God. We had a very poignant experience of this just a couple years ago in Dallas. We were doing one of our science and faith conferences. Eric Metaxas came to interview me, and we were doing an interview, in fact, about the content of my new book just before it was to be published, The Return of the God Hypothesis, about scientific discoveries that I argue do point to God. And there was a young camera woman who was, to me, stage left, and I caught out of the corner of my eye that she seemed very emotional. She was weeping visibly, and Eric could see her better. It was almost a little bit distracting, but she was so embarrassed about this afterwards, she wrote us a letter and explained that what she was hearing was so contrary to what she'd heard in college, and what she'd heard in college had been so distressing and created so much cognitive dissonance that the tears just began to flow. The thought that maybe there was evidence for God was to her life and breath. And this is a little passage from the letter. She said, "Throughout my college career, professors would constantly lecture that based on the evidence they had provided, there should be no way that anyone in class could believe in God. They'd argue that the science was proven and God was hence a myth. I was not equipped to present a valid opposition in debate. I was desperate to find commonality between my beliefs and my scientific education, but I could find none." And so she had been slated to go to grad school. She was apparently a very good young biologist, but she chose film production instead. She couldn't take the cognitive dissonance anymore. She never fully lost her faith. We know many students who have, but she lived in this state of thinking the facts were on one side and faith was on the other, and it was eating her up. Well, anyway, we've probed a bit more deeply on this. What is the scientific idea that makes so many young people and others think that belief in God is untenable or implausible or improbable? And in the survey we did, we found something really interesting surfaced, and that is that scientific theories about the unguided evolution of life, either the origin of the first life or the origin of new forms of life by undirected, mindless, Darwinian-style processes, were the number one reason that people cited for their rejection of belief in God. It was more commonly cited than worries about suffering, disease, or death, the so-called problem of evil. Didn't register. You got a picture of young, affluent kids going off to college. They probably hadn't suffered too much, but they had their brains scrambled by an alternative worldview that was supposedly based on science. And for us, this was interesting, but not too hard to understand, because this is what the Darwinians and the proponents of Darwinian evolution have been telling us for a long time. Stephen Jay Gould explained it this way. He said that Darwin developed an evolutionary theory based on chance variation and natural selection, and then he went on to say a rigidly materialistic and basically atheistic version of evolution. It's not just the idea of change over time, but Darwinian evolution is the idea that new forms of life have come online, there's been change over time, but it's purely undirected and unguided. There's no mind, no designer, no creator behind the process. It's nature effectively creating itself through these natural processes. And this quote is so interesting to me because he's indicating that this scientific theory has profound worldview implications. When I was teaching, I used to write terrible. I'm a terrible artist. I would draw pictures on the board to try to depict worldviews and conceptually. My students finally helped me convert to PowerPoint to avoid my artwork. And this is a drawing I used to make. The circle represents the physical world. The pendulum represents the laws of nature. The guy getting moved by the laws of nature represents the idea that we're totally determined by them and have no agency, no free will, no choice. And then, of course, the Michelangelo God in the Ghostbuster sign indicates for this naturalistic or materialistic worldview that Gould is talking about does not admit the possibility of any designer, creator, intelligent being beyond the physical world. Matter and energy are the whole show. And everything has come about by undirected material processes. So this is the worldview known as materialism. By the way, how many are familiar with that term worldview? It's not, okay, very good. I mean, it's not something you necessarily use in oil and gas, but I think a Christian group like yours should be familiar with it. Just a little story. Maybe don't need to tell it, but it's fun. I did geology and physics as an undergraduate. Big reason I did that was my dad was an engineer, and he was a very practical guy, fixed the car, everything. I was the kid with the head in the clouds, thinking about all the big questions, bumping into things, losing things. So I'd be helping him, try to fix the car, and he'd ask for the wrench, and I'd drop it in the most inaccessible part of the engine, and he'd say, oh, this son of mine. And got time to go to college, and he said, look, I know you don't want to be an engineer, and so you can major in anything you want, but let me give you a piece of advice. Before you choose a major, make sure you take 2 years of college math, because if you don't have the math, you're going to be limited. I said, okay, Dad, I'll take the math. I went to a small liberal arts college. After you take 2 years of college math, there were only 2 things you could major in, which was physics and math. And the physics was, I think, the closest thing to engineering, and I think that's what Dad wanted me to major in, and so I did. So it all worked out, except that I'd sneak across campus every semester and sign up for one philosophy class. And so one semester I'm taking atheistic existentialism, the wallowing in existential despair, and I was extremely good at it, and I got an A. And my grade slip came home at Christmas time, and we had this Germanic work ethic in our family, and even in college, my dad's going over the report card, and the first class up was a class called Theoretical Mechanics, which was my most important physics class that term, and he looks at it, and he looks at me, and he says, B. And then the next one up was this philosophy class, and the grade is an A, and then he reads it like he reads the A like that's a bad thing because I got a B in the other class. And so he gives me this look, which in our family meant it's now time for offspring to give account of offspring's behavior. And I said, well, Dad, I got real defensive. I said, this philosophy stuff, I know it doesn't mean anything to you, but it's really important too, because that's where you understand people's worldviews. And that's how, and if you don't understand a person's worldview, you don't understand why they use the words they use to describe things, and you don't understand their political commitments, and you don't understand, and he cut me off and he says, son, you don't need a worldview. You need a job. This is an all-men's group, and I'm now that dad, so I now understand this, but I thought that was very oppressive at the time. But before Christmas break was over, the resume was put together, and that's how I ended up working for ARCO. In any case, materialism is this very dominant worldview in our culture. And I think we can recognize it if I'm going to list some of the tenets of this way of thinking. God does not exist. Man arose gradually from lower animals by mindless, undirected material processes. Human beings have no intrinsic value. There's no qualitative difference between humans and animals. Free will is an illusion. Objective morality is an illusion. It's all relative, baby. Life has no ultimate purpose, and when we die, we rot. Any of those kind of ways of thinking sound familiar? They're percolating into the culture, and there's a proverb that tells us why this is important. It says, as a man thinketh, so is he in his heart, or so shall he act, depending on the translation. Or as conservative people often say, ideas have consequences. So this point came home to us in a really poignant way. Several years ago, we'd done a film, a theatrical release documentary on our idea of intelligent design with Ben Stein. You may have seen it, I don't know. And a couple years after the film came out, we got a call from a bereaved father whose son had committed suicide. The father was a military chaplain. His son was actually a Christian all growing up, all the way through his military service. He got out of the military, the son, his name was Jesse Kilgore, and he was taking biology courses, and there was a Dawkins acolyte professor who was aggressively proselytizing him in service of this scientific atheism. And he was challenging students to read The God Delusion and ridiculing Christian students for being afraid to engage these arguments. So Jesse started to read the book. And after they found his body, they also found his annotated version of The God Delusion under his bed. And you could see the progression of his thought in the margin notes. First it was sort of anger at Dawkins, wanting to challenge him, and then it was perplexity, couldn't really answer the arguments. Then it was this loss of faith, and then just a sense of loss of hope and purpose in his life. And many people, there is this near epidemic level of teen suicide we have. We've had a couple even in the school where my kids went in high school, in a fairly affluent area, Redmond, where all the Microsoft people are. So it's not happening among kids that have everything going for them. It's not a generalized anxiety disorder as the psychologists talk about it. For many, many young people, it's a metaphysical anxiety. They can't answer basic questions about the purpose of their lives. The more life seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless, to quote Weinberg. So this materialistic worldview and the science that supposedly supports it is having a really profound effect on the ground, if you will, in the culture, in lots of different ways. I'll just touch this very briefly, but these mass shootings often come with manifestos from the shooters. And very often they have been young people who, for example, in the Columbine case, who are citing Darwin or Nietzsche or this atheistic scientific scientific atheism as a philosophy. The Columbine shooters actually cited natural selection. They said it's the best thing that ever happened to the earth. Getting rid of all the stupid and weak organisms. It's all natural, yes. The guy in Buffalo who just was involved in the big shoot also was citing a Darwinian racist. So there are many, many ways in which we see this materialistic worldview percolating into the culture, having an effect. As the culture thinketh, so is it acting. And it's very personal with the suicides and the shootings. It also affects our politics. If you don't believe in God, then our whole concept of rights makes no sense. And we end up, if there's not God as the ultimate authority, we end up inevitably centralizing vast amounts of authority with the central government. And people who are involved here, maybe in the pro-life movement, also can detect the materialism in what they're opposing. Because what's the fetus to the pro-choice people? It's a lump of tissue, right? It's not a person made in the image of God. It's a material thing and nothing more. So materialism, we think, is a philosophy that has lots of deleterious consequences in the culture. The question we've been asking at Discovery Institute is, why is that materialistic philosophy so persuasive? Why is that the default worldview among the elites in the knowledge culture, in the law schools, the courts, the media, the scientific labs, the universities, the university professorate? Well, the answer, we think, actually goes back to the science of the late 19th century. And this is the Gould quote. Darwin gave us this atheistic account of where everything came from. It was an atheistic creation story. Marx told us about the utopian future that would come as a result of these purely materialistic, he called it dialectical materialism after all, these materialistic forces that would lead us to a utopian view of the future. And Freud told us what to do about our guilt. And so between these three great materialist scientific prophets, these guys answered all the great questions that Judeo-Christian religion had always answered. The question of creation, the question of eschatology, where things are going to end up, and the question of soteriology, how are we saved? What do we do about the human condition and about our guilt? And they formed a scientific basis for an alternative, non-theistic, non-Christian worldview. And so that's the bad news I have to share today. That is still the dominant worldview in the elite knowledge culture. But the good news I have to share is that the scientific basis of that worldview has been entirely eroded by major discoveries about biological and cosmological origins, about where life in the universe came from over the last 100 years, and the pace of those discoveries is quickening. There's more and more evidence pointing in a decidedly theistic direction. And I want to just give you three little snapshots of three key discoveries that I think are challenging materialism and bringing back what I call the God hypothesis, the idea that God provides an intellectual framework, an explanatory framework for making sense of the world. So if you're an intellectual, the last thing you should be is a scientific atheist. The first of these discoveries is the material universe. The universe of matter, space, time, and energy had a definite beginning a finite time ago. And since we're in a Christian organization, I'll say, as the Bible itself has long affirmed. First words of Genesis were, after all, in the beginning. The first inklings of this came in the 1920s as astronomers were building these great dome telescopes. This is a picture of Edwin Hubble, the famous astronomer from the Palomar Observatory at Mount Wilson. He became an astronomer in the 20s. He came out of law. at a very propitious time because they were building these beautiful dome telescopes. And he used these telescopes and new technology using photographic plates with long exposures to image little points of light in the night sky. And when he did, he discovered that some of those little points of light weren't other stars, they were whole other galaxies. And in addition, he learned that the light coming from those galaxies was stretched out in longer wavelengths than would be expected. And if you know the physics of the Doppler shift, if the train whistle or the police siren is receding, the pitch drops. The same thing happens with light. If the object from which the light is coming is moving away, the light stretches out and looks redder than it would otherwise look on analysis of the spectra. And so these astronomers started looking at all different quadrants of the night sky, and they realized that the light was stretched out everywhere, suggesting that the universe was expanding. And so just quick illustration with a physical, like a balloon. Well, there's one other part of it. The further the object was away, the faster it was expanding, which suggested a spherical expansion, like a balloon blowing up. So if you think in the forward direction of time, the history of our universe looks something like this. See the nifty spiral galaxies I drew on the balloon. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger, okay? Now that's a mind-blowing discovery. We live in a dynamic, expanding universe. Again, a biblical connection. Isaiah, Psalms, Zechariah, 14 places in the Tanakh, the Old Testament Bible, it says the Lord has stretched out the heavens, or in some places, He is stretching out the heavens. The astronomers have discovered this. But now wind the clock backwards in your mind's eye. If you go back 100 years, 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years, however old you think the universe is, you eventually get to a point where all that galactic material would converge on a point, marking the beginning of the expansion of the universe and arguably the beginning of the universe itself. Now, there are a whole bunch of different discoveries that have been made that have reinforced this idea of a definite beginning. Oh, I got a little animation. Is that? Yeah, there we go. Okay, we got this nifty animator at Discovery. This is essentially what the astronomers are seeing today. The universe expanding outward, the galaxies expanding outward. But one more little cut on this. Einstein didn't like this idea at all initially, but his own theory of general relativity, his theory of gravity, also implied a beginning to the universe. And here's why. The idea of general relativity is the idea that massive bodies actually curve the space around them. And so if you pass light by, the light should curve, and indeed it does. Strange, weird concept, but that's what physics has discovered. Stephen Hawking in the 1960s is thinking about this because he's doing black hole physics. And he knows the astronomers are saying that the universe is expanding outward in the forward direction of time. But he thinks, well, what would happen in that reverse direction? Well, all the matter would be getting closer and closer and closer together as you go back in time. But if the matter's getting closer and closer together back in time, the space would be getting more and more and more tightly curved. And eventually you get to a point when the matter all converges on that beginning point, you reach a limiting case where the curvature of space goes to an infinite corresponding to zero spatial volume. But you can't put anything in no space. And so you get a picture from physics of the old medieval doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing physical. You go from nothing to everything in a blink of an eye. And they call that the cosmological singularity. The laws of physics break down at a point in the past. You can't back extrapolate any further. There was a beginning. So this is a mind-blowing conclusion that's come right out of physics. It confirms the biblical view of things. It also sustains or underwrites a cosmological argument for God's existence, which I first heard in Dallas, 1985. I'm a young scientist. I go to a conference, and Alan Sandage, the famous Caltech astronomer who was Edwin Hubble's graduate student, joined. The conference was divided between atheists and theists discussing the big questions, origin of the universe, origin of life. Sandage climbs to the podium. Everyone thinks he's going to sit down with a materialist, and he sits down with a theist. In his talk, he announces that he's had a religious conversion. He's become a Christian. He's an agnostic Jew who's become a Christian. And he explains how what we call the Big Bang Theory had led him to the point of having to acknowledge the existence of God. And this is what he said in part of the talk. He said, here is evidence for what can only be described as a supernatural event. There is no way this could have been predicted or explained within the realm of physics as we know it. How could you explain the origin of matter, space, time, and energy materialistically? If before there was matter, space, time, and energy, well, what could be, if matter, space, time, and energy begin, you can't invoke matter and energy to explain the origin of matter and energy because they began, which means they didn't exist before that. It's all very puzzling from a materialistic point of view. Sandage wrestled with this and eventually came to faith. Second big discovery. From the very beginning of the universe, the universe has been what the physicists term, what they call finely tuned. It's been finely tuned to allow for the possibility of life. There are many different physical parameters: the strength of gravitational force, the strength of electromagnetism, the other fundamental forces of physics, the speed of light, the masses of the elementary particles, the strength of the force that's pushing the universe apart. All of these things turn out to fall within very fine engineering tolerances. They can't be too much or too little, too heavy, too light, too strong, too weak. The fine-tuning is extraordinary. It's in the case of the force pushing the universe apart, it's 1 part in 10 to the 90th power. One little smidge this way or that way, and you either get a big crunch or a heat death. And as the physicists have thought about this is stunning. It's unbelievably improbable that we would have a life-conducive universe, and yet there's no underlying physical reason for any of these parameters having the values that they do. And many physicists have come to the conclusion that the obvious explanation for the fine-tuning is a fine-tuner. And Sir Fred Hoyle, great British astrophysicist who was an atheist who opposed the Big Bang Theory because he thought it supported the Christian doctrine of creation, eventually comes around because he discovers some of these key fine-tuning parameters and later says a common sense interpretation of the data suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with physics as well as chemistry and biology in order to make life possible. I always love the way the monkeys make it into the origins theories. You know, you can imagine them on a typewriter or whatever. Okay, discovery number 3, and that is the design of life. In particular, the discovery of the digital code in the DNA and the whole information storage, transmission, and processing system that's inside what Darwin used to think of as the simple cell. It's not simple at all. 1953, most of us know about the Watson and Crick story. They elucidate the structure of DNA, and there's something about the structure that suggests to them at the time that it could be an information-carrying molecule. 5 years later, in 1958, Francis Crick formulates something called the sequence hypothesis, suggesting that the subunits that run along the interior of the molecule, can you see them, the ones that are labeled A, C, G, and T? These are called nucleotides or nucleotide bases. He suggests these subunits of the DNA are actually functioning like alphabetic characters in a written language. Or we'd say today that like the digital characters in the section of software. And over the next 7 years, Crick's sequence hypothesis is validated by experiments going on both sides of the Atlantic in a period of time historians call the molecular biological revolution. Incredibly creative scientific experiments. And what they discover is that, in fact, the digital code is functioning just like Crick said. It's directing the construction of the protein molecules that are necessary to keep cells alive, the proteins and protein machines. So I'm sure people in this audience would know about CAD/CAM technology. That's a way to understand what's going on inside the cell. Up in Seattle, we have the famous Boeing company. Boeing uses CAD/CAM to build airplanes. Engineers sitting at the console, writing code. The code goes down a wire. It's converted to a machine language. The machine language and code then goes to the manufacturing arm, and it would, for example, direct the placement of the rivets on the airplane wing. Digital information directing the production of a mechanical system. That's what's going on inside our cells right now. It's unbelievably awesome. And so when the scientists discover this, all of our theories about the origin of life coming out of the prebiotic soup and the chemicals just arranging themselves just get shot. to heck. And there's been an impasse for 40 years now in what's called origin of life biology. That's the subject I studied in my dissertation work in England. And just to amplify this sequence hypothesis idea, Bill Gates has said the DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever created. Richard Dawkins himself has acknowledged it's like a machine code. And in origin of life biology, people have realized we don't know how to get from chemistry to code. Because in our experience, this quote is an early pioneer in the field of information theory, and he applied information theory to the analysis of molecular biology. This is what he said: the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. That's what we know from our experience. And I came across this passage in grad school, hit me like a thunderbolt, because I asked, well, is that true? And I got to thinking, well, absolutely. I couldn't think of any examples to this rule. Hieroglyphic inscriptions, paragraph in a book, information in a radio signal, information in digital code and software. It all has in common the same kind of cause, a mind, rather than an undirected material process. So I ended up developing this argument in a lot more detail in one of the big fat books that's floating around here today, Signature in the Cell, and developed a scientific argument for what we call intelligent design. That the best explanation for the information necessary to build life is actually a designing mind. It's interesting, I came into this because in '85 when I went to this conference in Dallas, I was doing digital signal processing of seismic sections. And when I learned in the origin of life discussion at this conference that the big impasse was that on both sides, the theists and the atheists, they all agreed we don't have any explanation for the origin of the information, of the digital information in the DNA. That's what hooked me. That's what got me fascinated. And I made this strange transition from oil and gas into the philosophy of science. My dad couldn't make any sense of that. Okay, 3 big discoveries, just in review. The material universe had a beginning. The universe has been fine-tuned for life since the beginning, or from the beginning, and since the beginning we've had big infusions of information into our biosphere that have made possible the origin of the first life and actually new subsequent forms of life as well. And as a result of these and other discoveries, a lot of scholars and scientists are now catching on to the fact that maybe this scientific atheism doesn't really explain things very well. One historian of science has recently said the idea that God created the universe is a more respectable hypothesis today than at any time in the last 100 years. In my book, I go further. I push the argument further. I say that the God hypothesis, a theistic design hypothesis, provides the best overall explanation for biological and cosmological origins, for the origin of the universe, its fine-tuning, and the origin of the information necessary to make life. Now let me just go back to where we started with this concern about our culture. There's a great quote from one of the Princeton theologians in the 1920s, one of the evangelicals there, J. Gresham Machen. And he said that false ideas are one of the greatest obstacles to the gospel. We will succeed in winning only a straggler here and there if we permit the whole collective thought of the nation to be controlled by ideas which, by the force of logic, prevent Christianity from being regarded as anything more than a harmless delusion. I think that's what we're experiencing right now. This difficulty of evangelism, the loss of faith among young people, and all the cultural consequences of that. But I'd just like you to think for a minute about a different tree, not the one that I showed before, showing the bad fruit of materialism. But what if we restore, as St. Paul calls it, the knowledge of God to the culture? And what if science can be part of that restoration process? If we can make the case for the intelligent design of life in the universe and get this message out, I think, and this is our conviction at Discovery Institute, that if we do that and begin to make the case that the things that are made, as St. Paul puts it, point to the unseen qualities of the Creator, I think we can renew the culture. And that's what we're about. So I want to just thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions with as much time as we've got, and any afterwards as well. Thanks.